When you hear the name Caligula, what comes to mind? For most, it's a caricature of insanity, a highlight reel of absurdity. The horse he tried to make a senator, the war he declared on the sea, ordering his soldiers to stab the waves and collect seashells as the spoils of war. These are the bedtime stories of history, the comfortable madness we used to assure ourselves that such a ruler was a bizarre anomaly, a freak accident of power. But these stories, as strange as they are, serve a dangerous purpose. They sanitize the man. They turn a monster into a meme, a tyrant into a punchline. The truth is infinitely more complex and far more disturbing. The truth is that the most terrifying thing about Caligula wasn't his insanity, but the cold, methodical, and often brilliant intelligence behind it. The real horror of his reign wasn't written in grand, absurd gestures, but in the quiet, systematic corruption of the human soul. This is not a list of depraved acts. You will not find a simple countdown of atrocities here. Instead, this is a psychological autopsy. We are going to place the mind of a Roman emperor on the dissecting table and search for the origins of the disease that consumed him. Together, we will trace the pathology of power, from its first innocent symptoms to its terminal, monstrous conclusion. We will seek the answer to the oldest question about evil. Was the monster born, or was he made? This journey will take us from the heights of hope to the depths of horror. We will begin with the boy the Roman people adored, the golden child of a heroic lineage, seen as a savior destined to heal a wounded empire. We will stand watch as a mysterious, near-fatal illness cracks open his mind, unleashing a predator who would not just break Rome's laws, but rewrite them in the language of nightmares. And at the heart of that nightmare, we will find his ultimate weapon. For Caligula discovered a truth more powerful and more terrifying than any army. He discovered that the deepest fears, the most fragile loyalties, and the very essence of a person's identity could be controlled, shattered, and remade through a single primal force. He discovered how to weaponize sex, not for pleasure, but as a tool of absolute domination, as a public spectacle of humiliation, and as the ultimate blasphemous proof that he was no longer a man, but a living, breathing, and terrifying god. Before the monster, there was the myth. Before Caligula the tyrant, there was Gaius, the golden child of the Roman Empire. To understand the depths of his depravity, you must first understand the heights from which he fell. He was not born in the shadows. He was born in the brilliant, blinding light of a legend. His father was Germanicus, the most beloved general of his generation, a charismatic, victorious commander who embodied every Roman ideal. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of the first emperor, Augustus himself. She was fierce, fertile, and fiercely loyal. Together, they were a walking, breathing symbol of Rome's future, a promise of a new golden age. And Gaius was their miracle. Born in a military camp, he was the army's darling. The soldiers, rough and battle-hardened men, adored the small boy who toddled around in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny military boots or caligae. It was they who gave him his lifelong nickname, Caligula, Little Boot. It was a name spoken with gruff affection, a term of endearment for the mascot of Rome's most powerful legions. In these early years he knew nothing but adoration. He was the son of a hero, the grandson of a god, the beloved pet of an army that could conquer the world. He was untouchable. This perfect world, this fortress of love and power, was the first thing that was taken from him. And it was not taken gently, it was ripped away, leaving a wound that would never heal. The first tremor came in the year 19 A.D., in the opulent city of Antioch. His father, the invincible Germanicus, fell violently ill. The histories, written by men like Tacitus, paint a scene of Gothic horror. The general's body was racked with convulsions. Foam frothed at his lips. He was convinced he was being poisoned, not by a foreign enemy but by a rival within the Roman power structure. When he finally died, his last breath was an order to his wife to avenge him. The body was displayed in the Forum of Antioch, and those who saw it swore it bore the signs of black magic and poison. The Golden family's myth had its first crack. For the 7-year-old Caligula, it was his first brutal lesson in the true nature of Roman power. Your greatest enemy is not the one you face on the battlefield, but the one who smiles at you in the Senate. A hero's death was not glorious. It was agonizing, paranoid, and delivered by an unseen hand. The death of Germanicus was not the end of the tragedy. It was the beginning of the hunt. With the hero gone, his family was no longer an asset to the empire. They were a threat. The reigning emperor Tiberius was a man consumed by a suffocating paranoia. He saw Germanicus's surviving family not as grieving relatives, but as a rival dynasty waiting for its moment. And so, he began to dismantle it, piece by agonizing piece. First came Caligula's mother, Agrippina. She had obeyed her husband's dying wish, returning to Rome not as a quiet widow but as a furious accuser. This act of defiance sealed her fate. Tiberius had her arrested, publicly flogged so viciously that she lost an eye, and exiled to the barren island of Pandateria. There, she was systematically starved to death, refusing the food forced on her as a final, desperate act of protest. Next were the brothers. Nero, the eldest, was declared a public enemy and banished to the island of Pontia, where he too was starved until he died. The second brother, Drusus, was imprisoned in the dungeons of the Palatine Hill in Rome itself. His jailers kept a meticulous, horrifying diary, recording his descent into madness as he starved, chewing the stuffing of his mattress in a desperate attempt to survive. After 9 days of this agony, he was gone. Imagine this. You are a boy, barely a teenager. You are the son of Rome's greatest hero. And you watch, helpless, as the emperor, your great-uncle, the man who is supposed to be your protector, methodically, cruelly, and publicly annihilates your entire family. Your mother, starved and broken. Your brothers, erased. Your name, once a source of pride, is now a death sentence. Every friend, every ally, every person who ever showed your family kindness now shuns you, terrified of being associated with your cursed bloodline. Love, you learn, is a liability. Loyalty is suicide. Grief is a luxury you cannot afford, because to show it is to admit you are an enemy of the state. Your mind becomes a fortress, and inside you bury the bodies of your family where no one, not even the emperor's spies, can see them. Then, the monster who devoured your family invites you to dinner. In the year 31 A.D., Tiberius summoned the last surviving male of Germanicus's line, the now 16-year-old Caligula, to his infamous island retreat, Capri. This was not an act of mercy, it was an act of supreme control. Capri was not a palace, it was a gilded cage, a laboratory of cruelty presided over by a paranoid emperor in his final, depraved years. The historian Suetonius, who had access to the imperial archives, describes Capri as a cesspool of perversion, a place utterly detached from law, morality, or human decency. It was here that Tiberius built his sexual theaters, training specialists called spintriae to perform depraved acts for his entertainment. It was here that he would have those who displeased him thrown from the cliffs onto the rocks below, where sailors waited in boats to beat the broken bodies with oars until they were lifeless. This was not a home for the orphaned Caligula. This was his university. For 6 years he lived in this psychological crucible. What does a boy do in that situation? He adapts, he learns, he becomes an actor. He learned to smile at the man who murdered his mother. He learned to anticipate Tiberius's moods, to flatter his ego, to become the most obedient, servile, and unassuming companion imaginable. He showed no sign of resentment, no hint of ambition, no flicker of the rage that must have been burning inside him. He played the part of a harmless, devoted servant so perfectly that the court historian Tacitus would later write of him a chillingly prophetic observation. Never was there a better servant or a worse master. This performance was his salvation, but it came at a terrible price. Every day was a master class in monstrosity. On Capri, Caligula didn't just witness depravity, he studied its application. He saw how Tiberius used sexual humiliation as a tool to break the will of powerful senators. He saw how the threat of violence, arbitrary and sudden, could enforce absolute obedience. He learned that when you have absolute power, morality becomes a suggestion, not a rule. Empathy, he would have realized, was a fatal weakness. Kindness was a performance. Cruelty, however, was honest. Cruelty was a tool. He watched Tiberius orchestrate the downfall of his most powerful advisor, Sejanus, with cold, calculating brilliance. He saw how the emperor turned the Roman legal system into a personal weapon, using treason trials to eliminate rivals and seize their wealth. He was studying the grammar of tyranny from its greatest living practitioner. The boy, who was once Little Boot, the army's darling, was dead. He had been murdered along with his family. In his place stood an empty vessel, a young man who had survived by mirroring the monster who held his leash. His mind, once filled with the promise of a golden age, was now a perfect reflection of Tiberius's Capri, a beautiful exterior hiding a realm of paranoia, sexual violence, and bottomless contempt for humanity. The mask he perfected was flawless, but a mask, by its nature, conceals pressure. For 6 years, the grief, the rage, and the terrifying lessons of Capri were compressed within him, waiting for a crack to appear, waiting for a moment when the performance could finally end. All he needed was a stage of his own. And in the year 37 A.D., when Tiberius finally died, Rome, in its joyful, desperate ignorance, was about to give him the largest one in the world. The death of a tyrant is a strange and intoxicating moment. For years, the Roman world had held its breath under the suffocating paranoia of Tiberius. His reign, which began with promise, had curdled into a long, gray twilight of treason trials, executions, and a suffocating fear that emanated from his island fortress on Capri. When the news of his death finally reached Rome in March of 37 A.D., the city did not mourn. It erupted. It was a carnival of liberation. Statues of the dead emperor were torn down, and the common cry in the streets was, "Tiberius to the Tiber," a demand that his corpse be thrown into the river like common refuse. Into this explosion of joy rode a figure of almost messianic hope, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. Caligula. He was 24 years old, handsome, and the last surviving son of the beloved Germanicus. To the Roman people, his arrival was not merely a change in administration. It was a prophecy fulfilled. He was the living embodiment of a future they had been promised and had thought lost forever. He was the beautiful, tragic orphan, the boy who had survived the monster's den, emerging not broken, but as a symbol of resilience and hope. His journey from Capri to Rome was a triumphal procession unlike any other. Crowds lined the roads for miles, hailing him as our star, our darling, our baby. The sheer outpouring of adoration was overwhelming. The Senate, eager to curry favor with the new ruler and to distance themselves from the taint of Tiberius, swept aside the dead emperor's will which had named Caligula co-heir with his young cousin. Instead, they vested full, absolute, and unconditional power in Caligula alone. They gave him the world. In a single, euphoric moment, the boy who had spent his youth as a prisoner was now the most powerful man on earth. And for a time, it seemed that Rome's wildest hopes were justified. The first months of Caligula's reign were a masterstroke of political genius, a performance so brilliant it convinced an entire empire that the sun had truly risen. He was everything Tiberius was not: generous, open, and merciful. He began with a speech to the Senate so full of humility and promises of cooperation that it brought the hardened politicians to tears. He declared an end to the hated treason trials. He burned the records of his family's persecution, vowing that the past was dead and a new era of trust had begun. He recalled political exiles, paid the generous legacies left by Tiberius which the Senate had tried to void, and showered the Praetorian Guard and the army with massive bonuses, securing their loyalty. He understood the power of spectacle. He abolished unpopular taxes, and then made a public show of burning the tax records in the Forum. He staged lavish gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances, dazzling the populace who had been starved of entertainment under the dour Tiberius. He was seen everywhere, a charismatic and accessible ruler, a stark contrast to the reclusive emperor who had hidden on an island. It was a false dawn, but it was breathtakingly bright. Rome fell completely and utterly in love with him. They saw the ghost of his heroic father in his eyes and the promise of Augustus in his every move. They believed they had found their savior. The savior, however, was a hollow man. The performance was flawless, but it was still a performance. The mask he had perfected on Capri was still in place, now polished for a much larger audience. He was giving them exactly what they wanted, mirroring their hopes just as he had once mirrored Tiberius's moods. But the rage, the paranoia, the trauma of his stolen childhood, it was all still there, compressed and waiting. He had survived by becoming a vessel, and now that vessel was filled with the adoration of millions. But a vessel is, by its nature, empty, and the pressure was building. The breaking point came just 7 months into his reign. In October of 37 A.D., the Golden Emperor, the darling of Rome, fell desperately ill. The nature of the sickness is one of history's great maddening mysteries. The ancient sources are vague. Was it a physical ailment, perhaps encephalitis, an inflammation of the brain, or even epilepsy, which was rumored to run in his family? Or was it a mental collapse, a complete psychological breakdown under the impossible weight of his past trauma and his new godlike power? The Roman world held its breath. The temples were filled with citizens praying for his recovery. The city that had just celebrated its liberation was now paralyzed with the fear of losing its new hope. He did not die. After weeks of torment, Caligula recovered. He rose from his sickbed, but the man who returned to the public eye was not the same man who had left it. Something inside him had shattered. The mask, held in place for so long by a will of iron, had finally cracked. The performance was over. The abyss that he had so carefully concealed for his entire life had now stared back at him from the edge of his own grave. And what emerged from that confrontation was not the charming prince, but the monster he had been trained to be. The psychological interpretations are, of course, modern, but the results were ancient and terrifying. One theory suggests that the illness, possibly causing high fevers and delirium, inflicted permanent brain damage, destroying the part of his mind that controlled impulse and empathy. Another, perhaps more chilling theory posits that the illness did something far simpler. In cheating death, in feeling the prayers of an entire empire focused on him, The line between man and God, already thin in his mind, dissolved completely. He had faced his own mortality and emerged, in his view, immortal. He was no longer just a ruler. He was a divine being who had conquered death itself. The rules of man no longer applied. The change was not gradual, it was immediate and brutal. The first sign that a fundamental shift had occurred was his treatment of those closest to him. Macro, the powerful prefect of the Praetorian Guard who had engineered Caligula's smooth succession, the man to whom he arguably owed his throne, was one of the first to go. Caligula forced him to commit suicide. His young cousin, Gemellus, with whom he had been named co-heir in Tiberius's will, was executed on a flimsy pretext of plotting against him. His own father-in-law was forced to slit his own throat. The purge was swift, merciless, and deeply personal. These were not political threats in any real sense. They were something far more dangerous. They were reminders of his past. They were men who knew him when he was Gaius, the boy. They were living connections to his mortal, vulnerable self. By eliminating them, he was not just consolidating power, he was erasing his own history. He was severing the last tethers that bound him to humanity. The beloved star of Rome had burned out, and in its place a black hole was forming. A vortex of paranoia, narcissism, and a terrifying, godlike certainty. The fever had passed, but the patient was lost. The charming smile was now a predator's grin. The generous hand now signed death warrants. The Roman people had prayed for their emperor's recovery, and their prayers had been answered, but in the cruelest way imaginable. They had gotten their emperor back, but they had lost the man. And the creature that now sat on the throne was about to teach them the true meaning of fear, not with armies or prescriptions, but by turning the most intimate parts of their lives into his personal theater of horror. The creature that emerged from the sick room was no longer content to be a mere emperor. The title of princeps, or first citizen, a fiction maintained by his predecessors to appease the fragile egos of the Senate, was an insult to him. He was not the first among equals, he was a god among insects, and he would spend the rest of his reign forcing the Roman world to acknowledge this blasphemous, terrifying new reality. His transformation was absolute. He began demanding that he be worshipped as a living deity, a new Jupiter on earth. He built temples to himself. He replaced the heads of famous statues of gods with his own likeness, but these were just stone and marble. To truly prove his divinity, he had to demonstrate his power not over objects, but over the very souls of the men and women he ruled. And for this, he chose his ultimate instrument, sex. For Caligula, sex was never about lust. It was about power. It was the ultimate expression of his divine right, a tool for breaking down the boundaries of law, tradition, and human dignity. It was a language, and he used it to speak one simple, terrifying message: everything and everyone belongs to me. The first and most profound taboo he shattered was the one at the heart of the Roman family, the sanctity of blood relations. The ancient historians, particularly Suetonius and Cassius Dio, paint a horrifying portrait of Caligula's relationship with his three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and his absolute favorite, Drusilla. They write that he engaged in incestuous relationships with all of them, not in secret, but openly, often at lavish public banquets, while his own wife was present. We must, of course, approach these sources with a degree of caution. These historians were writing decades after Caligula's death, and they belonged to the senatorial class that despised him. Their accounts were designed to portray him as the ultimate monster, a perversion of all Roman values. Some modern historians argue that these stories were exaggerated propaganda. But here is a more chilling thought. What if they were true? And even if they were merely rumors, the fact that they were so widely believed by the Roman elite reveals the profound psychological break Caligula had achieved. In a society obsessed with bloodlines and patriarchal honor, incest was the ultimate act of social and religious pollution. But for a man who believed he was a god, it was a perfectly logical act. The gods of Greco-Roman mythology, from Jupiter and Juno to the Egyptian deities like Osiris and Isis, frequently married their siblings. For Caligula, sleeping with his sisters was not an act of perversion. It was an act of divine emulation. It was a theological statement. It was his way of proving, in the most visceral way imaginable, that he was no longer bound by the pathetic mortal conventions that governed his subjects. His obsession with Drusilla went beyond even this. He treated her not just as a lover, but as a goddess consort. He had her declared a living deity just like himself. When she fell ill and died suddenly in 38 AD, his reaction was not that of a grieving brother, but of a god whose immortal partner had been stolen. He plunged the entire empire into a period of public mourning so extreme it bordered on the absurd. All business was forbidden. To laugh, to bathe, or to dine with one's family was declared a capital crime. He had her deified, making her the first woman in Roman history to be officially recognized as a goddess. He had effectively created his own divine pantheon, with himself as the ruling god and his dead sister as his queen. The message was clear. His family was not of this earth. They operated on a celestial plane, far above the judgment of mere mortals. This divine worldview had terrifying consequences for the mortals below. If everyone was beneath him, then everyone was his property. This belief found its most grotesque expression in his treatment of the Roman aristocracy. The senators and equestrians, the most powerful men in Rome, were the primary targets of his psychological warfare. He despised them for their arrogance, their hypocrisy, and most of all for the memory of what their class, under Tiberius, had done to his family. And he found the perfect way to break them. Not by executing them, which was crude, but by systematically dismantling their honor, using their own wives and daughters as the instruments of their humiliation. Suetonius reports that Caligula turned a wing of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill into a fully operational, high-class brothel. But the women forced to work there were not common prostitutes. They were the wives and daughters of the most respected senators. He would send out imperial heralds to invite men of all classes to the palace, advertising the new merchandise available. This was not a desperate attempt to raise money as some sources claim. The revenue generated would have been trivial for the imperial treasury. This was a calculated act of political theater of the most sadistic kind. Imagine the psychological devastation. A senator, a man whose entire identity was built on family honor, dignitas, and public reputation, would be forced to watch as his wife or daughter was prostituted by the state, their bodies becoming a source of imperial revenue. He could not protest, because to do so would mean immediate execution for treason. He could not object, because the emperor was a god, and the god was simply making use of his property. Caligula had created a perfect, inescapable trap of humiliation. He was not just cuckolding these men, he was annihilating their very identity as Roman nobles, turning their greatest source of pride, their family name, into a mark of public shame. His cruelty was often improvisational and intensely personal. At his dinner parties, which were legendary for their opulence and terror, he would often pause the meal, select the wife of one of his distinguished guests, and take her to a private chamber. After a short while, he would return to the banquet hall, the woman in tow, and proceed to give a loud, detailed, and often critical review of her performance in bed, while her husband was forced to sit there, silent and smiling, amidst the laughter of the other guests. This was a spectacle of absolute power. He was demonstrating in front of all their peers that he could take anything he wanted, whenever he wanted, and that there was nothing anyone could do about it. He wasn't just violating their wives, he was violating their sense of reality, forcing them to participate in their own degradation. Even marriage, the bedrock of Roman society, became another one of his cruel games. He would attend the weddings of prominent nobles, and sometimes, in the middle of the ceremony, he would have the bride abducted and brought to him. After sleeping with her, he would divorce her on the spot and send her back. He married and divorced multiple women in rapid succession, treating his wives less as partners and more as political props or temporary objects of interest. Every act was designed to show that the institutions that held Rome together, family, honor, marriage, law, were meaningless before the whims of a god. He had found the rotten core of the Roman elite's soul, their obsession with public image and patriarchal honor, and he was squeezing it until it burst, not for pleasure, but for the sheer, terrifying spectacle of it all. A mind that recognizes no boundaries in the bedroom will soon recognize no boundaries in the world. Caligula's sexual sadism was not a private pathology. It was the engine of his public policy. The same contempt for human dignity and the same godlike certainty that fueled his personal atrocities began to bleed out, poisoning every aspect of his rule. The last 2 years of his reign were a descent into a surreal, nightmarish theater of the absurd, where the emperor's twisted psyche became the empire's reality. The madness, once confined to the palace, now engulfed the state. The most famous symbol of this imperial insanity is, of course, the story of his horse, Incitatus. According to the historians Cassius Dio and Suetonius, Caligula adored this horse beyond all reason. He gave Incitatus a marble stable, an ivory manger, a jeweled collar, and a staff of slaves. He would invite the horse to dine with him at official banquets, feeding him oats mixed with gold flakes. But the ultimate act, the one that has echoed through history as the final proof of his madness, was his stated intention to appoint Incitatus to the consulship, the highest office in the Roman Republic. Was this the act of a lunatic? A man who genuinely believed his horse was a worthy political candidate? Perhaps, but it is also possible to see in this a far more terrifying and calculated motive. Consider the audience for this gesture: the Roman Senate. These were the men he despised, the men whose wives he had prostituted, the men he saw as corrupt, sycophantic, and useless. By suggesting his horse could perform their job, he was not elevating the horse. He was delivering the ultimate insult to the Senate. The unspoken message was a masterpiece of political sadism. You are all so worthless and pathetic that this animal, who does nothing but eat and sleep, would be a more effective leader than any of you. It was an act of supreme contempt, a political statement so absurd and so humiliating that it left the senators utterly powerless. To protest would be to admit they felt threatened by a horse. To remain silent was to accept the insult. It was the same psychological trap he had sprung on them in the palace, now played out on the grand stage of Roman politics. His reign became a series of these surreal, terrifying performances. The most infamous was his so-called conquest of Britain, which morphed into a war on the god of the sea. In 39 A.D., he marched 2 massive legions, perhaps as many as 100,000 men, to the northern coast of Gaul, facing the English Channel. An invasion of Britain was imminent. But then the plan inexplicably changed. Instead of ordering his men onto the ships, Caligula commanded them to deploy in full battle formation on the beach. He then ordered them to attack the ocean itself. The legionaries, the most disciplined soldiers in the world, were forced to stab the waves with their swords and javelins. After this battle, the emperor declared victory over Neptune and commanded his men to collect seashells from the beach as the spoils of war. He then packed these shells into chests and sent them back to Rome to be displayed in his triumph. Again, was this insanity? A genuine psychotic break? Or was it something more sinister? Some modern historians speculate that this entire spectacle was a bizarre form of punishment for the legions, who may have been secretly mutinying against his planned invasion. By forcing these hardened warriors to perform such a humiliating and absurd task, he was asserting his absolute dominance, reminding them that their lives, their honor, and their very purpose were subject to his every whim, no matter how irrational. He was demonstrating that his power was so absolute, he could literally command them to fight the forces of nature. As his behavior grew more erratic, his paranoia, the seed of which had been planted in his childhood, grew into a suffocating forest. He saw assassins in every shadow, conspiracies in every whispered conversation. The treason trials he had abolished at the start of his reign returned with a vengeance, but now they were stripped of even the pretense of legality. Executions became a daily form of entertainment. He was said to have a favorite phrase he would repeat to his executioners when ordering a slow, agonizing death: "Make him feel that he is dying." He would complain that his reign was not marked by any great public calamity, like an earthquake or a plague, and that he hoped for the annihilation of an entire army or a great famine to make his time as emperor more memorable. He had become a god, but a god of chaos and fear. He had torn down every institution, violated every taboo, and humiliated every powerful man he could find. In doing so, he had made a fatal miscalculation. While he was busy breaking the souls of the senators, he had neglected the men who held the swords. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards, were not intellectuals concerned with honor and tradition. They were practical men, and they began to realize that serving a master whose whims were so unpredictable, so violent, and so utterly divorced from reality was a direct threat to their own survival. The conspiracy formed within the very heart of his security detail. It was led by Cassius Chaerea, a tribune in the Praetorian Guard, whom Caligula had relentlessly taunted for his high-pitched voice and supposed effeminacy. The emperor's constant personal humiliations had finally pushed a hardened soldier too far. On January 24th, 41 A.D., as Caligula was walking through a secluded corridor beneath the Palatine Palace, the conspirators struck. Chaerea delivered the first blow, stabbing the emperor in the neck. The others descended upon him, a frenzy of blades. The man who had declared himself a god died on the cold stone floor, stabbed over 30 times. The rage was so great that the assassins then stormed the palace, murdering his wife Caesonia and his infant daughter Julia Drusilla by smashing her head against a wall. They were determined to extinguish his entire line, to ensure no heir could rise to avenge him. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the Senate, emboldened for the first time in 4 years, saw an opportunity to restore the Republic. They convened and began to issue a damnatio memoriae, an official condemnation designed to erase a person from history. They ordered his statues to be destroyed, his name to be chiseled off inscriptions. It was a testament to the sheer terror he had instilled. They didn't just want him dead. They wanted him to have never existed. But it was too late. The Praetorian Guard, having killed one emperor, had no intention of giving up the power to create another. They found Caligula's terrified uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain and declared him the new emperor. The age of one-man rule was here to stay. Caligula was dead, but the system that created him had survived. Caligula's reign lasted just 3 years and 10 months, but in that brief, feverish span of time, he burned an image into the soul of history so vivid and so grotesque that it has never faded. When we sift through the ashes of his rule, it is tempting to dismiss him as he was dismissed in his time, as a simple madman, a biological accident, a glitch in the imperial machine. But that is the easy answer. It is the comfortable answer that allows us to place him in a locked box, labeled not applicable to our time. The more terrifying truth is that Caligula was not merely an aberration, he was a product. He was the logical, monstrous result of a perfect storm of personal trauma and absolute, unchecked power. He was a walking, breathing testament to what happens when a broken mind is given the authority of a god. His childhood was a clinical study in the creation of a predator. He was born into a world of love and adoration, only to have it systematically dismantled by a paranoid tyrant. He learned from the master Tiberius that cruelty was a tool, that sex was a weapon, and that empathy was a fatal flaw. He survived by becoming a flawless actor, burying his rage and grief so deep within him that, by the time he took the throne, he was little more than a hollow man wearing a charming mask. The power he was given was absolute. There were no checks, no balances, no institutions strong enough to contain him. The Senate was a collection of frightened sycophants. The people adored him blindly. The army was bought. When his mysterious illness finally shattered the mask, there was nothing left to stop the monster from emerging. He became a god because there was no one left to tell him he was a man. And so, he set out to remake the world in his own broken image. His infamous sexual practices were not the random acts of a degenerate. They were a calculated assault on reality itself. Incest with his sisters was a theological statement, a claim of divinity. The palace brothel was a political weapon, designed to humiliate and neuter the aristocracy. His dinner party abuses were public spectacles of dominance. He used the most intimate and vulnerable parts of the human experience as a stage to perform his own godhood, forcing everyone around him to become actors in his terrifying play. The story of Caligula is more than a lurid tale of ancient Roman depravity. It is a timeless and chilling warning. It warns us that the line between reason and madness can be perilously thin, and that a lifetime of trauma can curdle even the brightest promise into the darkest poison. It reminds us that the true danger of tyranny is not just the loss of freedom, but the loss of reality itself, as the whims of a single, broken mind become the law for millions. Most of all, Caligula's story is a profound indictment of any system that places a single individual beyond accountability. He existed because the Roman system allowed him to. He flourished because the institutions that should have constrained him, the Senate, the law, tradition, had already been eroded to the point of irrelevance. History is not merely a collection of stories about the past. It is a mirror, reflecting the eternal patterns of human nature. The saga of Caligula forces us to look into that mirror and ask ourselves some deeply uncomfortable questions. Where do we place our trust? What are the ultimate safeguards against the abuse of power? How strong are the institutions we rely on to protect us from those who would declare themselves gods? If you believe that remembering the darkest chapters of history is the best way to keep them from repeating, then you understand the mission of this channel. Subscribe and join us as we continue to unearth the stories that have been buried, because it is in confronting these historical nightmares that we learn how to protect our own waking world.